4.
Like most children, I grew up afraid of monsters. Mysterious creatures that sneak up on you in the dark. As I got older, I still feared monsters, but the monsters were no longer creatures in my closet, but an addiction waiting for me in an all-too-accessible needle. Monsters that I had seen consume people time and time again. Unlike most children, my first friends were the cast of CSI, the narrator of a true crime show with an eerily soothing voice. See, my obsession with criminal justice and criminal behavior had already been long established before I was even old enough to be legally charged with a crime. I wanted to know everything there was to know about how we caught the bad guy. However, my obsession led me to discover some of the faults within the system that I loved so much. Our justice system falls short in some pretty critical areas. One of the biggest dysfunctions that we're facing today is drug addiction. You see it in the news all the time with headlines that are increasingly concerning, like Legally Dead, exploring the epidemic of prescription drug abuse. Overdosed, how doctors wrote the script for an epidemic. Uncured, explore the growing opiate epidemic. Countless articles attempting to highlight this rapidly growing issue. They sound less like news and more like a nightmare. These stories are not extreme coincidences, but a reflection of the most deadly drug crisis in US history. The New York Times did a deep dive in 2017 about the opiate epidemic. The statistics that they gathered were startling. On average, 90 Americans are killed every single day from opiate overdose. That number is comparable to car accident fatalities. And this trend isn't dying down. During a nightly business report speech, Vivek Murthy, a Surgeon General, stated, "We currently have 250 million prescriptions written for opiates every year. That's enough for every adult in America to have a bottle of pills and then some." And although this figure is startling, this epidemic is a long time coming. Many experts tracing back the root of this problem to the 1990s, when doctors were commonly overprescribing painkillers. There was a perfect storm of overprescription, more accessible cheap heroin, and more powerful alternatives. People became dependent on legally obtained painkillers. But when the pharmacies no longer fed their dependencies, desperate people turned to substances like heroin, and in more recent times, synthetic drugs like fentanyl, which is 50 times more powerful than heroin. In 2015, the New York Times also estimated that 75% of all heroin addicts admitted to using prescription opiates before turning to heroin. Chances are, all of you are thinking about someone that you know that is either struggling with an opiate addiction or has died from an overdose. There are many conflicting schools of thought on how to solve this issue, none of them coming up with clear answers. But what we do know is our current approach is not preventing death and addiction. What we do know is an estimate in 2015 by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration that stated 2.6 million people were addicted to opiates, and those narcotics were the cause for nearly 30,000 deaths a year. In September of 2016, CNN reported on a case in Huntington, West Virginia, where in just a 5-hour period, there were 28 opiate overdoses in that area. Now, I can't solve the opiate epidemic in just 15 minutes. But what I can do is start to change your perception on drug addiction. By changing the way that we think about drug addiction, we can start to change treatment as a whole. Because with the evidence that I've talked about just in these first few minutes, it sounds like I'm talking about a disease. This is no coincidence. I know the way to fight the plague was not calling a war on rats and incarcerating them 25 years to life. And with that segue, we get into the really fun stuff, the Nixon administration. In 1971, Richard Nixon claimed drug abuse as public enemy number 1, and with that, declared an official war on drugs. From that declaration, we created the Controlled Substance Act and the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. A big target at this time was cannabis use, which was also labeled as a Schedule I drug. The funny thing is about the criminalization of marijuana is that the movement was misguided and at some points flat out wrong. Nixon was even advised to decriminalize the drug in 1973, with full knowledge of how false this deadly marijuana narrative was. So that begs the question of why. Why would Nixon be so hard on a drug that most experts agree was not harmful? Why was he so hell-bent on criminalizing drug abuse? For that answer, we can turn to Nixon's own aide, John Ehrlichman. In 1944, he stated, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting people to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. But by then, the damage had been done. Mandatory minimum sentencing was in effect all over the country, and not much has been improved. It's true that marijuana has been legalized in many states, and it's becoming more widely accepted. But an estimate in 2013 by the FBI claimed that nearly half of all drug arrests are marijuana. And despite white and black people using cannabis pretty much the same, black people are arrested for it 4 times as much. At this point, I've established America's approach to drug addiction is not only ineffective, but targets people of color at an alarming rate. We've been fighting an unwinnable war for nearly 40 years. It's time for a new battle plan. Instead of attacking and incarcerating the addict, we need to focus on the addiction itself. In order to do that, we need to better understand why someone may become an addict. I'll go back to my heroin example. What causes heroin addiction? Seems obvious, right? Heroin causes heroin addiction. It's been a long-held belief that heroin contains chemical hooks that make your body crave the drug after 20 days of use. So by day 21, bam, congratulations, you're an addict. The danger of this logic is that it makes some sense. But what's left out of this reasoning is all of the other reasons that someone may become dependent on illegal substances. In preparation for this talk, I turned to a much more experienced man, Johann Hari, a researcher who did his own amazing TED Talk on the actual roots of addiction. He had articulated everything that I had been noticing over the years in a way that's really easy to understand. Starting with why nanas don't become junkies after they get a hip replacement. That may sound a little strange at first, but if you were to break your hip, you'd be taken to the hospital and be given diamorphine, a stronger, more pure substance than any addict could get on the street. So, if chemical hooks cause addiction, why aren't nanas craving heroin with their metal hip? It's the same reason why 95% of veterans that used heroin during the war in Vietnam stopped using when they came home. Bonding, as Hari calls it. Bonding to healthy relationships and activities is crucial for leading a healthy life. It's in our nature to want to bond with our environment. We can see the evidence of the importance of connection in an experiment with a catchy name called Rat Park. During its first iteration in the early 20th century, it was pretty simple. You get a rat, put it in a cage with 2 water bottles. One filled with normal water, the other filled with water laced with heroin or cocaine. And what these researchers found is that the rat preferred the drug water. Nearly 100% of the time, the rat drank the laced water compulsively until it killed itself. This changed in the 1970s when a professor of psychology named Bruce Alexander noticed that this experiment was off. The rat had nothing to do but drink the drugged water in an empty cage. He ran the experiment again, but this time he changed the environment of the cage, adding lots of colorful balls and tunnels, lots of food, and lots of rat friends to have lots of rat sex. The result of this experiment were pretty remarkable. When given an environment of connection, almost none of the rats used the laced water. None of them used it compulsively, and none of them overdosed. And you might be thinking, well, those are rats. What can rats tell us about humans? Quite a bit, actually. Just like the rats in Rat Park, and just like the vets in Vietnam, people do not become drug addicted when they have healthy connections. People who are addicted are bonding to drugs in order to compensate for the isolation that they're feeling, in order to cope with an empty cage. And when we look at addiction as a disease caused by isolation, it doesn't make sense to sentence an addict to a lonely prison cell, a higher security empty cage. A criminal record only creates barriers between the addict and reforming connection to society. The world has seen this rat park thinking in action. In the early 2000s, Portugal was facing one of the deadliest drug crises in all of Europe. 1% of the entire population was addicted to heroin. And for years, they tried the American approach, criminalizing and institutionalizing, but they only saw their problems getting worse and worse. When Portugal finally reached their breaking point, they instituted a board of doctors and scientists that came up with something pretty remarkable. They decriminalized all drugs. And I know, that sounds like a really scary thought. But they also implemented a very important next step. They took all the money that was once used for isolation and focused it on reforming connection to society. And not only do they have more traditional drug treatment programs like residential therapy and psychological therapy, but they go beyond that. They have job creation and giving microloans to former addicts to encourage small businesses. I'll give you the example of a mechanic, a former addict in this recovery program. If a business hires a mechanic for a year, the government will pay half of their wage. And what we saw from this was a 50% decrease in injected drug use, along with a decrease in overdose, along with a decrease in HIV among addicts. And every drug included in this study had similar results. What Vietnam, Rat Park, and Portugal's decriminalization is really telling us is that we need to think about addiction differently. Addiction is not about the chemicals, but your cage. We need to talk about individual recovery, but not only that, we need to talk about social recovery. Ending the drug crisis is not just about getting junkies clean, but giving them a community. Connections and bonds that they have been looking for in a needle, in a pill, in a powder, without the threat of abandonment and further isolation, without shame or stigma, with the willingness to be understanding and patient, by giving them Rat Park. Thank you.